Okay, and so, hi again. I just found out that apparently my first reading from Baudrillard was not audible. I'm testing out some new equipment lent to me, so didn't work, but try again. And I'm about to get back into. Am I audible? Can you hear me? Can you hear me? Okay, so let's try this again with the dark continent of childhood. And I'm just going to restart. There is now within the social and political order a specific problem of childhood, a problem inseparable from those of sexuality, drugs, and violence, hatred, and all of the insoluble problems posed by social exclusion. Like so many other areas, childhood and adolescence are today becoming spaces doomed by abandonment to marginality and delinquency. The news offers a daily chronicle of this violence: adolescents murdering their parents, violence of children against other children, violence among inner city youth, this latter still taking a relatively socialized form in gangs. But there are also other cases of purely individual acting out, as with a youngster from Coors. A child has for the first time entered the annals of mass killers. All of these episodes are inexplicable in a simple psychological, social, or moral terms. There is something else going on here which arises out of the very breakdown of the biological and symbolic orders. To begin with, the status of birth has been turned upside down after the status of death, which is unrecognizable today in properly human terms. Artificial insemination in all of its forms, genetic control and manipulation, everywhere birth seems in danger of being deflected from its natural destiny into an artificial one. The liquidation in the long term of a familial sexual genesis, of a psychical and biological begetting. It is the end of the child as bare not only of the duality of a man and a woman, but the duality of a past and a future, which alone creates a memory. As a result, the child becomes a technical performance, a mini extension of the parents, rather than a genuine other. A sort of byproduct of an incestuous doubling, ultimately not unlike the scissoparity or schizogenesis of protozoa, conceived as an ideal outgrowth in your image, the clone child, whose production from the DNA of a single one of your cells is currently being planned. As a technical operation, this is yet some way off, but it is already present in the scientific and collective imaginary, and even in the relationship between parents and their children. Ew. In fact, the child is no longer a children are substitute beings. I mentioned this in my last stream, but this is like the entire plot line of Dance Moms. Thanks, Baudrillard. Who are losing their natural otherness and entering upon a satellite existence on the artificial orbit of sameness. They will find it increasingly difficult to detach themselves, to find not their identity and their autonomy, as they are constantly being told they must, but their distance and their strangeness. The more genetic heredity is foregrounded, the more the symbolic heritage disappears. Even the pedal drama is not played out any longer, and somehow he sounds disappointed. There is no longer any resolution of childhood, since the psychical and symbolic conditions of childhood no longer even exist. Childhood is losing even the chance of surpassing and denying itself as such. It is disappearing as a phase in the metamorphosis of the human being. At the same time, it is as losing this distinctive spirit of its own and its singularity. It is becoming a sort of dark continent. For otherness inevitably re-emerges, but differently, in the form of a vast, shady complicity on the part of a generation which is at least last free from adult attention, but is no longer minded to grow up. An endless, purposeless adolescence, which is acquiring autonomy with no reference to the other. acquiring it for itself and in its turnings, in some cases violently, against the other, against the adult with whom it now has no sense of either descendance or solidarity. This is no longer a symbolic break, but a pure and simple rejection which may find expression in the lethal acting out. And it is not even acting out, since that it still presupposes the eruption of the phantasm into a real world, whereas here we are dealing with an infantile, quasi-hallucinatory state which reaches out back before the reality principle. Moreover, this pre-reality principle, infantile state coincides strangely with a world of virtual reality, our adult media world, the post-reality principle world, in which the real and the virtual emerge and merge. This explains the spontaneous affinity of the entire younger generation with the new virtual technologies. The child has a special relationship with the instantaneous. Music, electronics, drugs. All these things are immediately familiar to him. Psychedelic isolation does not frighten him. Where real time is concerned, he is way ahead of the adult, who cannot seem but a retard to him, just as in the field of moral values he cannot seem but a fossil. L'chaim to that, Zeb. Goodness gracious. Baudrillard is such a boomer. Don't tell him I said that, even though he's dead. Oh, foot and mouth. So the child enters a state of anomie, anomie, that's a word, of organic desocialization. But even when naturally produced, he's become an anomaly. He's out of time. The current tempo, based on immediacy, acceleration, real time, runs precisely counter to generation, gestation, and the time of bearing and raising, the long haul in general. No Zoomers allowed. Sorry. A Zoomer's like anyone under the age of like 19. Which I hope if you're under the age of 19, you're not watching this. No offense. The child is then logically condemned to disappear. Other methods ought to make it possible for us to do without this natural maturation of the human being. A process which is so long and the source of so many neuroses, of conflicts which few modern couples can withstand, and which was designed for a situation of generational continuity where the long-term transgenerational rituals in place. I think I actually understand what he's saying, and I completely agree. I'm scared for the future. Today, the general quickening of the pace of life condemns childhood to an accelerated obsolescence. Let us take some comfort, however, from the fact that there will always be children, though as objects of curiosity or sexual perversion or compassion or pedagogical manipulation or experimentation, or quite simply as vestiges of a genealogy of living beings, just as there will always be thoroughbred horses or pets or works of art or protected species or reserves. Even when the natural species long since has died out, they will be preserved in the same way as animals, which will soon have no other purpose than to be preserved and kept in a museum as traces of the genesis of man, man himself being destined for the status of future remnant in a world of clones. So the child concept will be fetishized. This is depressing. It already is, idealized and fetishized as a vestige of a species whose reproduction, become progressively a technical operation, no longer in any sense involves a sexed destiny, nor the marvelously accidental product of that destiny, the child. You only have to look at the Universal Declaration of the Rights of the Child, adopted by the UN, to know that childhood is already an endangered species. I can say no, I have the right to know who I am. I have the right to suitable and balanced food. Everyone must protect me against mental and physical violence. I have the right to sing, dance, play, and develop my gifts for the greater happiness, etc. Never has there been a more Ubu-esque declaration. Moreover, it makes mockery of children, turning them into performing monkeys by foisting upon them the legalistic mania of adults. So children will be exercised as natural beings, as anachronistic survivals from another age in a time of immediate optimal performance. Simultaneously, they will become a wild, delinquent criminal species. They will lose the belief that they are children, ceasing to compare themselves pejoratively with the adult model. Doubtless, they have always been potentially dangerous beings, a reality concealed. I was about to say congealed by pedagogy and the more modern bourgeois idealization of childhood. Baudrillard saying, "Bring back the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory." I feel that's what he's saying. His bootstraps. And they have always taken revenge for their inferiority in their own way, through ruse and blackmail, but that insubordination and revenge were merely relative because they were always doomed to disappear with time. But now it is a time which childhood is not going to have, and the evolutionary chain is broken. The child is going to turn against the adult as an all-out enemy. He will become the other, all the same, but now the other as alien, a monster produced by the breakdown in the symbolic chain of generations. Reality was the reality of the adult. Not even this is true today when he is no longer the master of it. Childhood, from the depths of its unreality, the depths of its idiotity, was one of the last bastions of the poetic illusion of the world. Like all other forms of illusion, it is doomed to disappear sooner or later, or to lead a purely auxiliary existence. This is the child no longer in any sense as destiny, as the accident bearing death as well as a jubilation for the parents, but the child is commodity, unfortunately inintegrable into the cycle of accelerated exchange, and hence become a non-standard product, an item from another age, floating most of the time between parents who no longer know what to do with it, but which, like the dead, like women, like the masses, like the object, like all the categories expelled from the dominant reason, still all it needs is to take its revenge and pose an insoluble problem for the masters of reality. That's a tricky one, because absolutely there is this rift. There's an intellectual, there's a practical and a social rift, particularly in a hyper-accelerating technological culture. But at the same time, did we ever really expect childhood to exist? I feel like childhood was only a thing that existed in the 50s. But that's just me. Or at least in our romanticization of the 50s. So next, I decided to go ahead and pull Fantastic! So for those just tuning in, we're reading Screened Out by Jean Baudrillard. And this essay, I'm only planning on reading maybe a third tonight. A third essay is The Disney World Company, just because we love continental analyses of Disney World. In the early 1980s, when the iron and steel industry of Lorraine went into irreversible decline, the authorities had an idea of cushioning the collapse by creating a European leisure park, an intelligent theme park intended to re-inject some dynamism into the region. It was called Smurfland. The managing director of the defunct steelworks became quite naturally the managing director of the theme park, and the unemployed steelworkers were re-employed as Smurf men. Sadly, when the park itself had, for various reasons, had to close its doors, the ex-steelworkers found themselves unemployed once again. Grim destiny which made them, first, the real victims of the world of work, then phantom victims of leisure, then, in the end, cast-offs from both spheres. But Smurfland was merely a miniature. The Disney enterprise is on quite another scale. To get some idea of it, you have to know that Disney Unlimited, after taking over one of the biggest American TV channels, is currently buying up 42nd Street in New York, the red light district of 42nd Street, to turn it into a kind of erotic amusement zone without changing it in any significant way. Really? It is merely transforming itself, a mecca of pornography in situ, into a subsidiary of Disney World. Really? Transforming the pornographers and the prostitutes, like the Smurfland steelworkers, into extras in their own world, all metamorphosed into something identical, into museum pieces, Disney characters. And do you know how General Schwarzkopf, architect of the US Gulf War strategy, celebrated his victory? With a gigantic party at Disney World. Man had taste. Such revelings in the Mecca of the imagination were surely a worthy conclusion to that virtual war. But the Disney enterprise goes further than the imagination. The great precursor, the initiator of the virtual reality of the imagination, is currently taking over the whole of the real world to incorporate it into its synthetic world in the form of an immense reality show, in which reality itself presents itself as a spectacle, in which the real itself becomes a theme park. I wonder what Paris Hilton would have to say about this. A reality transfusion, the way we speak of blood transfusions, except in this case it is a transfusion of real blood into the bloodless universe of the virtual. They are even rebuilding an exact replica of Disneyland Los Angeles at the Disney World in Orlando, like a kind of second level attraction, a simulacrum raised to the second power. This is the same job as CNN did on the Gulf War, the prototype of the event, which did not take place because it took place in real time in the instantaneity of CNN. Today, Disney might well restage the Gulf War as a global attraction. Christmas at Euro Disney was celebrated with the Red Army choirs. Everything is possible. Everything can be recycled in the polymorphous world of the virtual. Nothing is irredeemable. There's no real reason why Disney should not buy up the human genome, which is currently being sequenced, to turn it into a genetic attraction. Why not cryogenize the whole planet exactly as Walt Disney himself has cryogenized in liquid nitrogen? This is a myth. This is a myth. This did not happen. Walt Disney was not cryogenically preserved in any way, nor is his head in the haunted mansion. This is fear mongering, for the record. Back to the text. With a view to some kind of resurrection in the real world. But there is no longer a real world, and there won't be one, not even for Walt Disney. If he wakes up one day, he'll get the shock of his life. He won't wake up because he's dead. He's not cryogenically preserved. Baudrillard, I expected better scholarship from you. Yeah, Danny. I know, right? Oh snap, Jean. Do your research on Walt Disney. My favorite anti-Semite. In the meantime, from the depths of liquid nitrogen, he goes on annexing the world, both imaginary and real, subsuming it into the spectral universe of virtual reality in which we have all become extras. The difference is that as we slip on our data suits or our sensors, or tap away at our keyboards, we are moving into a living spectrality, whereas he, the brilliant precursor, has moved into the virtual reality of death. Baudrillard! But I'm leaving it alone. The new world order is a Disney-ish order. But Disney is not alone in this kind of attractive cannibalism. We've seen Benetton draw on all of the immediacy of the human drama in its advertising campaigns. AIDS, Bosnia, poverty, apartheid. By transfusing reality, the new media figure where misery and commiseration come to resonate together interactively. The virtual buys up the real as is and serves it up just so, ready to go. This feels like a Gorillaz album. Sorry. I have better taste than that most of the time. If this operation can be successful on such a scale without incurring anything but moral disapproval and indeed arousing universal fascination, this is because reality itself, with all of its frenetic clone activity, has already transformed itself into an interactive performance, into a kind of Luna Park of ideologies, technologies, works, knowledge, and even of death and destruction. All just right for cloning and resuscitation in an infantile museum of the imagination and a virtual museum of information. I wonder if Baudrillard ever had fun. Or felt that pang of nostalgia. Surely he had toys as a child. Similarly, there's no point looking for computer viruses. We are all caught up in the viral interconnection of systems, and the information itself, which is the virus, not yet transmitted sexually, but much more effectively conducted along digital channels. So Disney merely has to stoop down to pick up reality as it is. Built-in spectacle, as Guy Debord would say. But we are no longer in the society of the spectacle, which has itself become a spectacular concept. It is no longer the contagion of spectacle which alters reality, it is the contagion of the virtual which obliterates the spectacle. With its diverting, distancing effects, Disneyland still represented spectacle and folklore, but with Disney World and its tentacular tentacles, that's what that means, extension, we are dealing with a generalized metastasis, with a cloning of the world and of our mental universe, not in the imaginary register, but in the viral and the virtual. We are becoming not alienated, passive spectators, but interactive extras, the meek, freeze-dried extras in this immense reality show. This is no longer the spectacular logic of alienation, but a spectral logic of disembodiment, not a fantastic logic of diversion, but a corpuscular logic of transfusion, transubstantiation of each of ourselves, an undertaking of radical deterrence of the world then, but from the inside this time, not from the outside, as we saw in what is now the almost nostalgic world of capitalist reality. In virtual reality, the extra is no longer either an actor or spectator. He is off stage. He is the transparent operator. Lucas, yes, this is a simulation. I thought we had pretty much clearly established that by 2019 we were hitting simulacra territory. I thought it was like actually pretty well demonstrated mathematically that we essentially are SimCity at some point. But putting that aside, Louise, are we living in SimCity? I feel like you could answer this question for me. Anyway, back to Screened Out and Disneyland. And Disney wins on yet another level. Not content with obliterating the real by turning it into a 3D, the depthless virtual image, it obliterates time by the synchronizing all periods, all cultures in the same tracking shot by sending them. Is this really? This is your favorite book by Mark Twain. My personal favorite book by Mark Twain is Connecticut Yankee and King Arthur's Court. But Screened Out's like a close second. In this way, it inaugurates real time. Time is a single point, a one-dimensional time, a thing which is also without depth, neither present, past, nor future, but the immediate synchrony of all places and all times in the same timeless virtuality. The lapsing or collapsing of time, this is the real fourth dimension, the dimension of the virtual, of real time, the dimension of which, far from superadding itself to the three dimensions of real space, obliterates them all. So it has been suggested that in a century or a millennium, the old swords and sandals epics will be seen as actual Roman films dating from the Roman period, as true documentaries on antiquity. I'm thinking of, what's her name? Jewish actress, Elizabeth Taylor version of Cleopatra as Egyptian history. Oh boy. that the Paul Getty Museum at Malibu, a pastiche of a villa from Pompeii, will be confused anachronistically with a villa from the 3rd century BC, as will the works inside. Rembrandt and Fra Angelico will all be jumbled together in the same flattening of time. And that the commemoration of the French Revolution at Los Angeles in 1989 will be confused retrospectively with a real event. Disney achieves the de facto realization of this timeless utopia by producing all events, past or future, on simultaneous screens, remorselessly mixing all of the sequences as they would or will appear to a civilization other than our own. But this is already our civilization. It is already increasingly difficult for us to imagine the real, to imagine history, the depth of time, of three-dimensional space, just as difficult as it once was, starting out from the real world, to imagine the virtual one, or the 4th dimension. And the last one I wanted to read, because I have a particular personal interest in AI, is Deep Blue, or the Computer's Melancholia. The clash between a human being and an intelligent artifact, Kasparov against Deep Blue, is highly symbolic, not only on account of the prestige of the game of chess. Similarly, you see this happening with Go, like the top Go player in the world just recently resigned his position because he lost against AI. Fascinating stuff. But because it sums up the dilemma of human beings where all of our contemporary machines are concerned. Computers, virtual or cybernetic devices, networks, etc. Behind the instrumental, creative, or interactive use we make of such machines, there is at bottom always a clash, a challenge, a match, a duel, in which one of the parties may be checkmate or lose face. There's no interactivity with any of the machines any more, in fact, than there is with human beings. That is the illusion of communication. The interface does not exist. There is always, behind the apparent innocence of technology, an issue of rivalry and control. The game of chess merely carries the situation to extremes. So, in the end, Kasparov beat the computer and everyone was greatly relieved, since in a way the honor of the species was at stake. Even if human intelligence will one day have to admit defeat, that moment must be postponed for as long as possible. And this is what makes this victory somewhat ambiguous, for even if it was not rigged, and it certainly wasn't, Kasparov could not at all costs not win. Man dreams with all of his might of inventing a machine which is superior to himself, while all at the same time he cannot conceive of not remaining the master of his creations. He can do no more to this than God could. Could God have envisaged creating man superior to himself and confronting him in a decisive combat? That's what God did. Just saying. Jews. With Deep Blue, Kasparov was more or less pitting himself against a technical divinity, a technical superego divine in essence. Yet, that is what we do with our cybernetic creations, and we offer them a chance to beat us. Or, rather, it is our dream that they should surpass us, and to do this, of course, as a mark of our power, though we cannot bear this either. So, man is trapped in the utopian aspiration of having a double superior to himself, but one he nonetheless has to beat to save face. God himself, defeated by his own creature, would have committed suicide. Moreover, only on the occasion on which beings really stood up to him, in the Tower of Babel episode, he immediately cut off their supply lines in the form of language and mutual understanding. If computers were in danger of gaining as God did, of gaining the upper hand, should we not spread the same confusion among artificial languages as God did among natural ones? But we know that the diversity of language eventually became man's privilege and his absolute weapon. It is, in a way, thanks to that diversity that human beings got the better of God by inventing multiple worlds and multiple divinities, each in the image of their own respective languages. But, to come back to Kasparov, if he won, it was surely because he is, metaphorically capable of speaking more than one language, that of emotions, of intuition, of a stratagem, in a word, the language of play, not to mention the language of calculation. That's an interesting concept, AI and the concept of play. Huh. Whereas Deep Blue only speaks the language of calculation. The day the latter language prevails in whatever form Kasparov will be beaten, the day man himself speaks only that single language, the language of computers, he will be beaten. In terms of play, man is neither inferior nor superior to God. He has managed to keep up a kind of rivalry in open game. This is what we best can hope for. Balthazar Gracian said that God's strategy was to keep man eternally in suspense, but the proposition is reversible, and we too keep him in suspense. It is the same in the confrontation between natural and artificial intelligence. The rivalry is ultimately irresolvable, and the best thing is for the match to be eternally postponed. The possible victory of the computer poses no problem. We know it can be due only to calculating power. The interesting question is, what makes Kasparov win? The first answer is given by Kasparov himself when he says, "I play without thinking. My hands move faster than my thinking." Clearly, Deep Blue has no hands to move faster than its thinking. It can only think fast. Now it is a feature of human beings that they move faster than their thinking, thanks to something relating to their bodies, their sex, and which, in a way, does not even pass through the black box of the brain. You call it affect, intuition, strategy. You can call it psychology. But it isn't so much a question of any physical faculties which man might possess in addition to his mental faculties of calculation. The basic difference is that for Kasparov there is an opponent, another party. For Deep Blue there is nothing out there, no other, no opponent. It moves within the confines of its own program. The same applies here, relatively speaking, as with Desert Storm. For the Gulf War computers, there were no others, no Iraqis, no enemies, not even Americans in the end. The whole thing was played out in a closed circuit on a basis of calculation. Now it is precisely at this point, beyond the mental power of calculation, that human being can expect to be definitively superior in the relationship of otherness which is based on the relinquishment of his own thought. This relinquishment, which Deep Blue will never know, is the subtle assumption of game playing. It is here that the human being can impose himself through illusion, decoy, challenge, seduction, and sacrifice. It is this strategy of not going the full hog, of playing within one's capabilities, that the computer understands least well, since it is condemned to play at the height of its capabilities. Interesting. The syncopation or ellipsis of presence by which you provoke the emergence of the other, even in the form of the virtual ego of the computer, is the real game player's thinking. Kasparov has spoken to ask that it be taken into account of time on the clocks, of this dead time of the real during which he really thinks. That is to say, during the time which he is mentally absent while the other party, Deep Blue, is sunk in calculation. The human being takes this distraction of thought, this dead time, from his available time, whereas the computer does not divert a single second from its own calculating time. But, paradoxically, it is this which turns round against it. Honestly, I could see that happening. I think your grandpa was onto something. Be careful. I also don't own a microwave oven, like, not for tinfoil hat reasons, so I can't test your theory. I don't want to test your theory. Sorry. But paradoxically, it is this which turns round against it. Kasparov insists that on the fact after his first defeat, but doubtless you always have to know how to lose the first game, he played against his own nature within himself to entrap his adversary. This is just like the diary of a seducer. He learns to play weak moves to simplify or close up to the game. Clearly, within a simulacrum, you have to play against nature to simulate better than it does to catch it out. Catch it out by simulation, which, for it, is merely the simulation of calculation, whereas for human beings it is an ironic power. When up against the machine they have themselves programmed, let us not forget that it was men like Kasparov who programmed Deep Blue. Human beings can not only subtly deprogram themselves, become technically incorrect to stay ahead of the game, they may even have to take over the machine's own place. Like the illusionist who had invented an automaton which imitated human being so well that on stage he was himself forced to become mechanical and mimic the automaton to maintain the distinction. This is the only possible strategy. If you become technically correct, you are unfailingly beaten by the machine. There is another factor favoring the human supremacy here. This is the basic symbolic rule which states no player can be bigger than the game itself. The player must not be unbeatable, or the game may die. The player is mortal. The rules alone are immortal. Now, the absolute aim of the machine, its secret ambition perhaps, is to be perfect, unbeatable, and immortal, which shows it has understood nothing of the very essence of game playing, and for that reason it will always be beaten in the end, if not by the opponent, at least by the game itself. So there is little sense in predicting the certain victory of the machine in 2005, on the grounds that man has only cumulative knowledge, whereas the machine has exponential knowledge. For if the computer's knowledge is exponential, its thinking is not, which condemns it to a kind of exponential stability. At each move, it goes back to zero and goes through all of the operations again. Whereas man, who filters the data and actively considers only a few of what is actually an immense number of possibilities, is capable of extrapolating the data in a single direction without regard for the initial state. He thus has truly exponential thought as his command, thought which is creative of the unprecedented, unpredictable constellations, a kind of chaotic strategy which even a computer 1,000 times more powerful than Deep Blue could not match up to. Against the computer, man personifies, as it were, the infinity of complexity, which is not the infinity of calculation, which is perhaps closer to the infinity of chance. It would in fact be interesting to confront the computer with a game of chance, or in other words, a probabilistic disorder which is different from human disorder. Where would it find a winning formula? The machine may then be unbeatable in all kinds of operations, but where the essence of play is concerned, it is forever disadvantaged, forever out of the game. To have access to that essence, the machine would have to have invented it, which have to have access to that essence, the machine would have had to have invented it, would have had to have been able to invent the very arbitrariness of the rules, which is unimaginable. And it is too late for this. More generally, to be a match for the man, the machine would have to have invented him. It is too late for that too. In a desperate effort to look like him or to compete with him, the only remaining possibility is accident, and making a strategy out of that, or suicide. Man has invented machines which work, move, and think better than him, or think for him. He has never invented any which could take pleasure or suffer in his stead, nor even which can play better than he can, which perhaps explains why computers get such deep blues. Oh. Thanks for reading with me, guys. So, and again, for anyone who didn't catch up with the aborted first attempt at this video, this is to make up for missing on my normal Wednesday session this past week. So this coming week, we will be starting Phenomenology of the Spirit by Hegel, and at that point we will be switching off week to week, and after that I'm probably going to try and revisit Baudrillard again week after next with simulacra and simulation. So again, thank you for sticking your Saturday evening with me, and may you have a great rest of your evening, day, afternoon, morning, wherever you may be. Thanks again. Good night from your Philbook Doomer GF, and ending this